Hello. Today is Thursday, November 4th, and you are at the bar with Jennifer Braceras and Inez Stepman of Independent Women's Forum. And you're also with one of our favorite colleagues and friends, Julie Gunlock.
Hey, ladies.
So we're so excited to have three IWFers on here today instead of just two, especially since Julie is one of our favorite IWFers. But today we're going to be talking about the effort by parents in Loudoun County, Virginia, to take back their public schools. Loudoun County, of course, has received national attention in terms of some of the events that have come to light through Luke Rosiak's reporting and the investigative reporting of others. And that really has shaped the national conversation. It's shaped an election. This issue of the content and what's available and happening in public schools, even in a place like Loudoun, or some of our other examples are from Fairfax County. Now, these are blue counties, but they're also sort of suburban, wealthy. Not too long ago, they were pretty purple. I believe that Mitt Romney lost there only by like 8,000 votes or something in 2012. So these have recently swung to the left. They're not like, my point here is that it's not San Francisco, right? Where you some people I think dismiss some of these stories and say, oh, this is just, in the looniest places in America. And Loudoun County is not that. But we really have Julie here to talk about these topics today, because she, in addition to all of her policy work with IWF, she is a Virginia parent, a Northern Virginia parent. She's battled her own public school system for a long time. And we've talked about that in the past on her podcast and elsewhere. But she's also the director of the Independent Women's Network, which is a sister organization of ours that is helping women across the country to organize and unite to deal with so many issues, including this issue of woke indoctrination in schools. So she's talked to a lot of parents in that capacity.
Yes.
And later in the show, we're going to be joined by Professor Philip Hamburger of Columbia Law School, who will give us a legal perspective on parental rights. But for now, let's tee up our discussion about Loudoun County with this brief video describing one of the major controversies there.
Story that's making waves on social media. Parents in Loudoun County want answers tonight after two alleged sexual assaults in schools. Officials now confirming it is the same offender. Now the parents are suing the Loudoun school system, claiming the district's transgender bathroom policy is what allowed their daughter to be assaulted.
The first attack was reported inside Stonebridge High School in late May, where a 9th grade girl says a boy forcibly sodomized her inside of a school bathroom. Alicia Brand is talking on behalf of the victim's family.
And this is a really, really difficult time for them. I mean, their baby was sexually assaulted in the most heinous of ways.
While the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office was investigating, a Loudoun County School Board meeting devolved into chaos on June 22nd, where the victim's mother is heard on cell phone video telling the crowd what happened.
My child was raped.
Behind her, the victim's father is being arrested for disorderly conduct and obstruction of justice. The family says they were provoked by other parents. Fast forward to October 6th. Inside Broad Run High School, another girl is sexually assaulted inside of a classroom. Prosecutors confirm it was the same boy. Now parents are calling for the superintendent's job. The night of the chaotic school board meeting, the board was discussing the transgender and gender fluid student rights policy, which allows students to use the restroom of their gender identity. And a school board member asked the superintendent,
do we have assaults in our bathrooms or our locker rooms regularly? I would hope not, but I would like clarification.
To my knowledge, we don't have any records of assaults occurring in our restrooms.
The superintendent told that to the board less than a month after the first attack.
His false statement on June 22nd and his failure to keep an alleged assailant out of school are far worse and merit immediate termination.
Story that's made.
Sorry. So obviously the story captivated the news cycle, although it got very little coverage from mainstream media right up until the New York Times stepped in to attempt to debunk certain aspects of it. So, for example, they made clear that this gender policy that was being discussed at the school board meeting had not yet been implemented formally in the school. although it's not clear at all. Let me say something quite obvious and common sense. If you do not have a policy of allowing, quote, gender fluid students to enter restrooms of the opposite sex, it's a little obvious when there's a boy sneaking into the girls' bathroom to hook up, which is apparently what happened
it's
in the
also
past.
true, Inez, that there may not be a formal policy that's been voted on by the school committee and approved by the superintendent, but there may be an informal policy that's happening at the school. That's usually how things start. Many times schools begin to implement things before they vote to have them go district-wide. So, just because there wasn't technically a policy that had been voted on the books doesn't mean that the school wasn't allowing it, condoning it, etc.
That's right. And obviously that's exactly what this girl's parents were doing at the school board meeting. They were trying to voice what had happened to their daughter as part of the debate around this policy and how this policy could potentially perpetuate those kinds of assaults. So that's obviously what they were trying to do. But Julie, what's your perspective on all of this? Loudoun is not all that far from you. It's pretty, actually, depending on traffic, it might be easier to get to Loudoun than it is to downtown DC from where you're at. So, how do you feel about all this?
I actually live very, very close to DC. It does take me a while to get out to Loudoun. And I will tell you, I do live in San Francisco. I live in the looniest section of Virginia. So I feel like I should be an honorable San Franciscan because of how nutty. Just to give you an example of how crazy it is, sort of this, obviously Loudoun's a great example of parents fighting back, right? Well, in Alexandria City, an actual employee of Randy Weingarten, who's the head of this teachers union, was elected on the school board. Okay. I mean, how does this happen, right? You'd think of all people, right? When your resume says that you actually work for Randy Weingarten, you'd think, well, parents would be kind of disqualifying, especially this year. But not here in Alexandria. They elected her. It's a mess here in Alexandria. But Loudoun County, you're right, is much more, I would say, sort of dark purple. It's certainly, I think the Biden election, I think they won. Biden won by, how much was that? 10 points, 15 points, something really large.
Yeah,
okay,
it was even. It was a blowout for Biden, but in the past, it's been more purple. Yeah,
right. But this year, what happened to Scott Smith? That is the father that you saw in that video. And the fact that they didn't just cover up the rape of that girl, and it was horrible what happened to that girl. But they transferred that student, did not alert the parents, transferred the students, didn't alert the parents at the new school, and again, covered it up. And there's other things about when Scott Smith got up to speak at that school board meeting. There was some of the school board members started texting each other. One got up to go and talk to. So it seemed very coordinated in terms of not wanting him to get up to that microphone where he would have revealed this rape, which again was concealed from parents. And the whole narrative was, if you have any problems with transgender bathroom policies, you're a bigot, and you have a problem with the LGBTQ community. And I'm really glad that you teed it up that way, because that video was very, I think, comprehensive in what we're dealing with here. Virginia did pass an LGBT, a sort of trans bathroom policy where if you're a student who identifies as any sex that you want, you can go into any bathroom. And there were some concerns. And so, the thing is, what we're seeing here is a school board willing to keep things from parents because they didn't want to in any way interrupt this sort of pro-trans, pro-LGBTQ narrative and this policy, which they viewed as very progressive. And so, essentially revealing that there had been assault in the bathroom would have complicated things for them. So they kept this from parents. And as a result, another girl was assaulted. So you have just total disrespect, not just for the parents, but also for the kids. I mean, my God, these kids are going to school there and they're transferring students. I mean, you mentioned in my intro that I have fought with my own school district. One of the things I fought with them on, I can't even keep track of how many things I fought with them on, but one of the things that I fought with them on was my son being beat up in a hallway. It was filmed. They wouldn't let me see the film. Because they had all these security cameras, they wouldn't let me see the film. They wouldn't tell me if the child and they admitted, everyone said, you should report this to the police. It was a violent attack. My son was hit from behind, sort of thrown across a hallway. And they said, yes, you should report this to the police. The police came in, but then there was no record of it in the school records. So other parents, if you say like, how many assaults have there been in this school? My son's assault was not shown. They didn't tell me who the perpetrator was. They didn't tell me what kind of discipline he would get, even without his name attached. They wouldn't tell me if he was going to be, if he was going to get a detention or expulsion or what kind of, discipline he would face. So as a parent, I'm left to just say, oh, well, go back to school. I hope they're monitoring it. They left me powerless. And
in so many cases, they're more concerned with the privacy and the reputation of the perpetrator of a crime than they are with the safety of the student population. I mean, frankly, you even saw that in some of the school shooting cases where, schools were well aware that a student had issues, was potentially trouble, had disciplinary problems, and the community, not being made aware and the school not taking action against those students. I think it's really important here. It's so hard for some people to separate this from the transgender issue, but I would caution parents, regardless of what you feel about that issue, even if you are in favor of people using, bathrooms with the identity, with their however they identify, you should still be concerned that your school committee, or at least this school committee, doesn't want parental input, doesn't want to know how you feel about it, and doesn't care how the students feel about it, and really they're behaving completely undemocratically.
Well, look, I think that this goes hand in hand with some other things that we've seen in Loudoun County, Fairfax County, and in Alexandria, because a lot of people think Alexandria is a part of Fairfax County. It isn't. So these are three distinct and separate school districts. So basically it's Northern Virginia. We're seeing incredibly graphic sexual content in school libraries. In fact, as you both know, IWF made an ad showing the images. They blurred out some of the most graphic parts of it and then tried to get those ads to go in Northern Virginia markets.
We have a copy.
Yeah, we actually.
I'm sorry. I shouldn't have.
No. This is perfect.
There it is.
There it is. These are photographs of a book that was available in the school library. And here it's blurred out, but there was no blurring in the book. And in fact, we have our other colleague, Kelsey Bolar, went on the Waters.
Joining me now to react, senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Voice and Loudoun County mom, Kelsey Bolar. Kelsey, this is just disturbing, and I'm not like a square guy or anything like this, but even for me, this is way too much.
It is absolutely insulting that we have a former president and a dad of two daughters doubting parents' sincerity when they express outrage over these types of images being available to students in public school libraries here in Virginia. Independent Women's Voice thought it was important enough that parents see these images for themselves. And so we produced an ad, tried to play it during the 11 p.m. hour when adults are watching TV here in Virginia, but those TV stations deem this ad too explicit for adults to watch. And yet we have these images available freely and accessibly to public school students, teenagers, and even children. It is unacceptable, and it's absolutely insulting that we have the Biden administration labeling parents speaking out about this as domestic terrorists and former presidents doubting our sincerity when we as parents try to have a voice and fight for our children.
Yeah, there's also...
Oh, sorry. I'll get this off. This thing off our screen for a minute.
Yeah, for those who might be listening and can't see it, I mean, the picture is very graphic. It's a graphic novel, I guess. It's cartoon-like. But it's literally pictures of somebody performing a sex act, and it's, not appropriate.
It's not appropriate, and yet, so it was, as I was saying, it was turned down by these multiple news stations at the 11 o'clock hour, or rather television stations at the 11 o'clock hour, where ostensibly kids are in bed, and yet these are available in libraries. There's other stuff, there's the sort of indoctrination we're seeing in schools, and it galls me to no end that you now have people saying CRT isn't a real thing. Well, no, they don't have like CRT 101. Okay. They don't have like, and today we will learn CRT. I mean, it's just so absurd. There's something called, it's interesting when the online learning, when COVID shut down the schools and went to online learning, there was something called SEAL time, social and emotional learning. And I opted my child out of that and said, read a book, because he certainly wasn't reading a book much during the day, or doing math, or doing composition, or learning how a sentence is structured. So so he read during that time, and the teachers were fine. They said, okay, well, but that is where a lot of this is going on, talking about how you identify, talking about how, you've seen the stories of kids being told. There's a number of viral videos from Loudoun County of kids reporting being told that they should feel bad for the color of their skin, or they should feel like victims. So there's a lot going on in Loudoun County, in Fairfax County, and in Alexandria City. And so the idea of, Kelsey kind of mentioned this, the idea of being sort of gaslit by politicians, by superintendents, by the school board, who then went even further and tried to get us all thrown in jail. It is incredibly frustrating. I think, though, there was some fear, and I was worried about this, that it would quiet parents. It would make them silent. And it had the absolute opposite effect. And certainly in Northern Virginia, where Youngkin did incredibly well, impressively well. I think all this sort of scheming to shut parents up from the school boards, from Merrick Garland, who, by the way, profits off this, or is his son-in-law, who owns a business that actually puts CRT in the schools, the FBI, and then, all of these sort of grifters who are profiting off this CRT stuff, and this sort of, I'm a diversity officer in a school. I thought this would sort of shut parents up and strengthen those people, but it really didn't. It had the opposite effect. And it's been wonderful as a Virginia parent to see how the activation of parents has really had great results.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Julie, because I think there's this massive gaslighting campaign right now going on, especially in the wake of Youngkin's win in Virginia, to say that this is a total myth. There's no CRT. I've even seen flatly stated in an actual news piece, CRT doesn't exist. Okay?
I know.
And by the way,
most
of the time you're totally right.
As somebody who studied at Harvard Law School under critical race theorist, professors, and edited critical race theory pieces for the Harvard Law Review, it does exist. And they are right that it is a law school theory. Yeah. However, as Julie said, no, they're not teaching, kindergartners or high schoolers critical race theory 101. What they're doing is implementing it. And what I explained to my kids, who said to me, like, oh, I've never heard the word critical race theory.
Right.
What I explained to them is, anytime your teacher tells you that this country is endemically and systemically racist, that the deck is stacked in America against Black people, that the deck is stacked against immigrants, that no matter what they do, they can't succeed because of white supremacy, you are learning critical race theory.
Exactly.
Well, so sometimes it is that explicit. But what you're talking about is, I think, really important, that the gaslighting of parents of the lessons that they actually object to. I mean, all of this like brouhaha over what counts as critical race theory is completely disingenuous. Totally. Parents care about the content of the lessons, but sometimes it is just flat out lying on their part. So, for example, this is the Board of Education in Virginia when McAuliffe was governor. So some of these images are from 2015. There were also some memos that went around in 2019 and even 2020 using this language, but I'm going to pull these up here. You have a presentation, right, sent out, culturally responsive teaching practices that use critical race theory, right? CRT makes learning more appropriate and effective for students from diverse backgrounds, right? Incorporate critical race theory lens. culturally responsive alternatives, right? Like sometimes it is literally that explicit. This is the Board of Education in Virginia that is putting out these materials and delivering them to districts. So it's completely and utterly disingenuous. It's an attempt to shut parents up.
It is.
You're totally right, Julie. It's an attempt to shut parents up, and it didn't work.
Yeah, but also it's an attempt to just not shut them up, to also ruin them. Like this is what we're seeing in the country in general. This is the whole, and I know that like the words woke and culture and cancel culture and all this stuff is overused, but this does exist. And this was and I will tell you, I think it really is like, I'm going to put I wish I had the piece of tinfoil to put my tinfoil hat on right now. Like, I know I'm going to sound a little tinfoil hatty, but look, you had an attack on IWF for posting maybe the most polite letter ever written in the history of letters by our policy director, Hadley Heath, who wrote a letter to her preschool, director saying, look, I really don't think, in the most incredibly polite way, can't say that enough. I don't know that we should really be asking preschoolers to wear masks. The Washington Post wrote that up as if Hadley said, go beat your teacher. I mean, it was insane. This was right around the same time that you had Merrick Garland sending that letter. The National School Board Association sent a letter to Merrick Garland. Then Merrick Garland sends a letter to the FBI. Okay. I mean, that's scary. If people think that, and then there's this video of Scott Smith, right? And there's no information on why he was so angry. Okay. And so,
and they humiliate him. By the way, they put the pictures of him with his shirt pulled up and his belly out, right? They're trying to humiliate him and make him the face of, domestic terrorism in the United States.
Yeah. So don't tell, I honestly, I think this was a case of some coordination of them. And again, I know this sounds great, but it just, with the timing, it was all at the same time.
You know what?
Let's not forget one thing. This was right after McAuliffe made that enormous gaffe in the debates where he said, I don't really think parents should have much say in children's education. No, I don't. And he was emphatic about it. I mean, during the debates, he wasn't like, well, I think the teachers are the experts here. No, he was mad. He was like, no, they shouldn't have a say in this stuff. So it all just seemed, look, I'm not going to say, the Washington Post reporter got on the phone with this guy, but it did seem a little bit, the timing of it was like there was a coordinated effort to not only gaslight parents, but scare them into silence.
Yeah, and it's so funny, Julie, because you talk about Hadley's letter, which they made it seem like a Koch-funded conspiracy. So essentially, anytime parents speak up, anytime parents raise questions, they are either racist, transphobic, or a Koch-funded conspiracy. Like, we're just supposed to be quiet. And
you forgot domestic terrorists.
Right. Exactly.
Yes, domestic terrorists. Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is coordinated in the sense that parents have had enough. And this is not just Loudoun County, right? This is not just Fairfax or Alexandria. These are red states, blue states. Parents are packing school board meetings with concerns about what their children are being taught, whether it's critical race theory, whether it's explicit sexual material, whether it's concerns about sports teams or bathrooms, right? Parents have had enough of this, especially after the last year and a half. I don't think you can overstate what the last year and a half of school closures and Zoom lessons have done, not just to show parents that that their children's education is a very low priority in the supposed education system, but also gave them a firsthand look into what their children were actually learning because they were sitting next to their kids watching these lessons.
And I know. I think my time is coming up to a close here, but I do want to say one thing. During the COVID shutdowns, I mean, there's been all this, teachers are heroes. Teachers are, oh, goodness. Where's the sympathy for parents? I mean, let's talk about how many women had to quit their jobs to stay home with their kids, and help them, as Mary Catherine, you mentioned, and as she called it school butlering or something. It really was
butlering. It's such a great phrase. Mary Catherine's phrase, Ham's phrase. Yeah.
Right. So, I think that you have, this situation where at the end of all this, it is astonishing after everything that parents have done to help schools get education completed, get kids through a year of education, that parents are now vilified. They're just absolutely vilified by superintendents, by these teachers unions. I think there's a lot of horrified teachers who are afraid to speak up. I have spoken to teachers who are like, I don't understand what's going on here. But it's really the sort of big organizations surrounding public education that are the ones that are vilifying parents. And it just amazes me, after everything that parents have been through, again, helping their kids with education, quitting their jobs, taking pay cuts so they have more flexibility or what have you. And then to have parents treated as badly as they have been, it really is a shocking sort of turn of events, I would say.
Julie, I know that at Independent Women's Network, there are a whole host of resources for parents and just people who want to get involved in policy disputes. Tell us just quickly before you go how people can access those.
Yeah, so we have launched this new network called the Independent Women's Network, and you can find it at iwnetwork.com. It is a members-only organization, members-only website. But one of the things we have on this website, and I think it's really perfect for this conversation, is we have a resource center where we put things in there like talking points and how to write a letter to the editor, how to FOIA. That's a big thing you're all going to have to learn, is how to FOIA, how to write an op-ed, how to use TikTok and Facebooks and some of these other social media. I mean, look, I'm not going to say my age, but I'm a little older. And some of these things are a little confusing. And I don't ever want to do a TikTok video, but some might, right? It might be a good way to get your message out. And so we have all this guidance on how to use these platforms and how to do these things that really activists do. And let's face it, I would say conservatives in general, but particularly conservative women, they don't view them necessarily, they don't view themselves as like, they want to raise their families. They want to be involved in their community in a helpful way, in a positive way. But I think everyone needs to step it up a little and become a little bit more of a respectful activist, and the network will help you do that.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you so much for coming on, and also couldn't second that network recommendation more. It's not even just the resources, although those are fantastic that Julie just laid it out for you, but it's also a place to meet other parents, other citizens who are concerned about a lot of these things. We have people who are moderate. We have people who are on the right. We have folks who are liberal, but they still find these things worrying. And this is a place, I think, to find each other and to gather that courage that Barry Weiss is always talking about.
And just the last thing I'll say, we also have like a daily must, which is curated articles from the best person we can all agree, Charlotte Hayes. And we have some fun. There's some funny things included, and there's some recipes, like my recipe for banana bread. So you can't go wrong, but it is a place for friendship and fellowship, but also guidance. So check it out.
Yeah.
And you don't want to miss Julie's recipes, trust me, because Julie is an amazing cook and baker. So I am not, so I just rely on Julie.
Well, cheers, lady.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you, Julie.
Cheers. We'll see you soon.
Great.
We're actually going to transition now to our next guest, which is Philip Hamburger. He's a scholar of constitutional law and constitutional history at Columbia Law School. He's also the president of the new Civil Liberties Alliance, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan public interest law firm or group organization that works to protect civil rights, civil liberties of American citizens by violations, very, very importantly, by the administrative state, by administrative agencies, which seem to do so much of our governance these days. He's also written extensively on that problem. But today we're going to talk to him a little bit about a piece he wrote for the Wall Street Journal a few weeks back about parental rights, about how those rights interact, or how those First Amendment rights might interact with the public school system and all of the issues that we were just discussing about Loudoun County. So welcome, Professor Hamburger. It's a pleasure to have you here at the bar.
Thank you. Great to be here. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really found your article in the Wall Street Journal fascinating. And you begin the piece talking about sort of the history and purpose of public education. And I'm wondering if you could just talk about that a little now for our listeners and sort of explain that framework and that background.
Right. So public education as we know it is really an invention of the mid-19th century. In the 19th century, people like Horace Mann and others worked hard to ensure that there was public education for all. And on the whole, that sounds very wholesome and good, but it there was more to it. Much of the backing for public schools came from nativists, native-born Protestant Americans who were worried about Irish Catholic immigrants. They're worried about a group of people they thought were enslaved to papal dictates and the like. So there was a little bit of animus that went along with this. And so it's no surprise that public schools were used essentially to inculcate a more Protestant approach to life amongst Catholic children. Now, we can emphasize the history, but of course it's structural. The moment you have state schools, we call them public schools, I think we call them government schools. The moment you have government schools with government-dictated curricula, there's always a danger for minorities. There's always a danger that a sort of homogenized vision of American life or religion or of other things get imposed. And it's been used for this repeatedly, right? It was used for nativist purposes for its first century. It may be used for other purposes now. I don't really care about which angle is being used. The danger is that if you have government education, someone will be using it against somebody else.
And the title of your piece is the public school system constitutional? Tell us briefly why you think it might not be.
Well, this is not the way people traditionally have thought about it, but I think there's a free speech angle on this. The difficulty is that education is largely speech, almost entirely speech. It's speech to children or with children, sometimes amongst children, but it's usually speech directed by those above from teachers. And this is a little awkward. Now, if you are taxed to pay for a government message, you have no constitutional objection to that, neither to the tax nor to the message. But parents are in a slightly different position. Parents are required by law to educate their children. And then the government comes along and says, look, it's for free. You don't have to pay anything extra for this. And so there's tremendous economic pressure on parents to accept public education. And it's not just to accept the government education. It's not just government education messaging. It's also that displaces their own. You know, they might have the evenings to teach their own messages. But when you take government education, you're displacing your own education, whether at home or in a school of your choice that you pay for. And this is what's known as an unconstitutional condition. Now, you think this sounds a little out there, right? You're thinking, that's unusual. I hadn't heard that before. And it's true, you haven't heard that before. But it's actually not that far out there. It's actually squarely within Supreme Court doctrine. What's odd is that, of course, we have, a century and a half of institutional history here. And so judges would be hesitant to overthrow that. But doctrinally, the claim is clear.
I think one of the helpful things to think about here is what public schooling in America looked like prior to the common school system that you're referring to, right? And that's maximum 150 years, but in some states, it didn't really get going until after the Civil War. Florida, for example, didn't really have like a common school system until the Reconstruction era. And then Massachusetts, obviously much earlier, had this kind of common school system, Horace Mann, all that. Jennifer over there representing Massachusetts. But what American education or public education looked like prior to that was something a lot more like actually what some conservatives or some even libertarians argue that our school system should look like today, which is to separate the public investment from, as you say, the government running schools. So what happened before that is that there was a certain pool of money with which a town would either hire a teacher in a schoolhouse, or that when the state started supplementing that pot of money, local pot of money, right? They started supplementing it with state dollars. Often what they would do is they would just send it to the local school, whatever it was, whether it was a Protestant Christian school. At that time, it was more like denominations of Protestants, right? So whether that was a Methodist school, whether it was a different denomination of Protestant Christianity. And when that system started to blow up is exactly when the common school system started to become more popular, was exactly when you had that system run up against real religious pluralism in America, where people had been kind of in a detente among Protestant groups. They were suddenly very unhappy for their dollars then in a town to go to a Catholic school, right? And And so that's when we started to transition, as you say, Professor Hamburger, we started to transition into this common school that nevertheless, until well into the 1950s, taught a functionally soft Protestant perspective.
Yeah, it's funny. The justification for this is that there's a compelling government interest in uniting people and giving the people a common culture in public schools. But of course, it isn't really the common culture. It's the government's vision of that being imposed, and which usually means majoritarian vision of it. So at all times, when we have this, there's a danger that the minorities, be it religious in the past or political or otherwise cultural, are being pushed into a common Americanism that actually isn't the common Americanism. It's something that someone wants to shove down their throats. I should emphasize, this is not distinctly conservative or libertarian or left-wing. I think this could be to the benefit of all parents of all backgrounds, perhaps particularly the poor, right? It could be liberating to recognize education as speech. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to throw in a little quotation here, because although this may seem somewhat radical and new, I want to just point out that the key case in this is Brown versus Board of Education. Most people think Brown versus Board of Education was simply an equal protection case, protecting against the inequality that was called separate but equal. But actually, Brown versus Board treats grade school education as a government benefit subject to an unconstitutional condition. So that's actually the key precedent here. I'll just quote to you one sentence. Such an opportunity, public schooling, where the state has undertaken to provide it, is a right which must be made available to all in equal terms. It isn't as if it's a constraint, which is the normal way rights are injured. It's an opportunity, it's a benefit, but it's subject to a condition that in Brown was unequal. And in this instance, it's an opportunity that's subject to a condition that is injurious to our freedom of speech. And there's no compelling government interest. The cases all say that education is compelling government interest, not government education, not public education. So it's pretty clear cut.
So you also rely on Pierce against Society of Sisters here. And sorry, something. Yeah, I'm probably mixing up my words, and it's been a while since I was in law school. But you also rely on Pierce as a major precedent here. And Andy McCarthy wrote a sort of rebuttal in National Review to your piece in the Wall Street Journal, in which he argues that you are misreading that case. Do you want to respond to some of the arguments that he made there?
Yeah, Andy's a good guy. I fear. So first, he misread my piece, which he sort of acknowledged in his second article. He just saw Loudoun County and thought, oh, Hamburger's arguing that parents can control the curricula. I'm not arguing that. It's the last thing I would argue. So I think he just misread my argument. And later he says, well, even if he had a different argument than I assumed, he's misreading Pierce. Actually, no. So let me explain. Pierce versus Society of Sisters was a case that comes out of Oregon in the mid-20s. The KKK, together with the Scottish Rite Southern Jurisdiction, a Masonic group, had urged compulsory education. And they were joined by the Democratic Party in this, and it sweeps Oregon. And so there's compulsory public education, which squeezes people out of private schools. So the Society of Sisters protests in their suit. They couldn't actually afford it. They're backed by the Hill Military Academy, which we don't really recognize, but we should recognize them, because without them, there wouldn't have been the case. And it doesn't come up directly as a free speech case, because it's not the parents suing, it's the school suing. So the court treated it as a substantive due process decision, reflecting the economic rights of the school. But at the same time, it also recognized that there was a little bit more to it. It talks about parental rights. So ever since, there's been this constitutional conundrum. What was Pierce really about? If you say it's about substantive due process, there's a certain danger, because that means it's ill-defined, whatever that right is, and it's not strongly based in text. In fact, substantive process is somewhat illusory sort of claim. So it's a weak interpretation of Pierce. So what I've done is come along and say, yeah, that's what they had to say to handle the case because of how it came up. But the right that's actually at stake here, the parental right of education that's in substance being recognized here, although not on the surface of Pierce, is actually the freedom of speech of the parents. Now, many people will say it's actually a religious liberty of the parents, and parents do have a religious liberty claim. It's just like the speech claim here. But it's not just religious parents. It's all parents who have this right. And so the clearest explanation of Pierce, although it's not on the surface of the case, is the free speech claim.
So essentially, in terms of, just to bring it back to practicality and what parents can do and what their remedies are, you are, as I understand it, essentially arguing that parents can't constitutionally be compelled to send their children to state-operated public schools. And so their remedy then is to take them out and go elsewhere, right? I mean, is that's your argument?
Well, you see, the problem is if you go is where it's at a very high price. And so there's all this pressure to go to the public school. Now, as a law professor who started a civil rights organization, the New Civil Liberties Alliance, which is focusing on administrative questions and conditions, I must say that I think the solution is going to be litigation, not immediately, because I think people first have to digest this somewhat different view of the world. But once Americans, parents pushing it, I hope, and eventually the judges recognize this perspective, I think it's inexorable. And so there should be eventually litigation asserting one's right not to be pressured into public schools. Now notice, it shouldn't be a claim, I want exemption from taxes. You're not going to get that. Nor should it be a claim, I want money to send my kid to what a school I want. Those are legislative decisions. So it has to be a very modest suit simply for declaratory judgment. After that, then the states will have some difficult decisions to make. But what they can't do is pressure us into government schools. And it doesn't matter whether it's severe indoctrination or just mildly contrary to one's taste. They have no authority to do that without violating the First Amendment.
So I read the sort of debate between you and my friend Andy McCarthy with great interest, and the way I sort of boiled it down, although he may have misread your argument partially because of the headline.
Yes,
but the way I sort of synthesize the Hamburger McCarthy arguments, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that it seems like it really boils down to a disagreement as to whether the problem can be solved democratically at the ballot box, or whether it needs to be solved through competition and school choice. I don't know if that's right, but I want to read a quote from Andy where he says, the First Amendment offers no quick fix here. The only way to solve the problem is through democratic accountability at the local level. Parents who have the greatest interest in their children's education must get themselves elected to school boards and make their voices heard in protest against progressive indoctrination. Now, I don't think you disagree with that. I certainly don't disagree with that, but it seems as if you're saying, Andy's saying that's the only way to solve the problem. It seems as if you're saying we need much more.
It's profoundly incomplete. I like Andy. I generally think his writings are great. I think his second article should have said, oops, I made a mistake, sorry, and moved on. But he didn't do that. Look, political engagement can help sometimes. But there are many people who find themselves in a minority of opinion without having the opportunity to win because they are in a minority. The First Amendment is all about protecting our freedom, regardless of whether or not one's in a minority or in the majority. Each of us as an individual has that freedom of speech. And no amount of optimism about the democratic process, and by the way, we don't have a democratic process, it's a Republican process, what's left of it. No amount of optimism about Republican institutions, rather tattered as they are, or if in their pristine state, should lead us to abandon our constitutional freedoms. And it seems to me absolutely beyond doubt, each pair of parents, because then we get complicated if it's each parent, but each pair of parents have a constitutional freedom of speech in educating their children. And nothing can take that away. nothing. So I was disappointed with that. I thought that was not one of his better pieces. As well as he is in so many other ways, which I would never dispute.
Let me ask you this. Why try to file this under the First Amendment rather than a distinct parental right to control your child's education? And I know that you're against the substantive due process, angle of this, but even if you take kind of the pre-substantive due process sort of tradition and say that this is a deeply rooted right in the American tradition to govern the upbringing of your children, why try to put it underneath the First Amendment?
Right.
Why not try to carve it out as a separate right that ought to be recognized?
Look, I would not discourage anyone from litigating the substantive due process claim, but when one brings litigation, one has it's like going to a smorgasbord or a buffet. You have choices, right? Are you going to have salmon first, or are you going to start with the beef? I like to start with the beef. And afterwards, when you finish the beef, you can try out the salmon. If that doesn't please you, then you can have some vegetables. And if that doesn't like you, you get a drink. There's a progression here. And it seems to me the strongest argument with the beef is freedom of speech. By far the strongest argument. It's rooted in the text. It's abundantly clear. We have Brown versus Board as well as Pierce for us here. And then there's the religious claim for religious parents, but it's much narrower because not all parents are religious, and the secular parents equally have rights here. That's why free speech first, then religion. And then one can talk about Pierce. But Pierce recognizes a parental interest in educating the children and so it says it's a constitutional right, but doesn't really specify what it is. And it's much better if you have a piece of paper, the Constitution, saying freedom of speech. That just is stronger. So what I think parents should do is start thinking in these terms. And that's why I'm so glad you're having me here. Thank you so much. Because we need to get the word out. Parents need to recognize they have freedom of speech in educating their children. That doesn't mean it's going to happen overnight. This is a big project. People have to reconsider 150 years of abuse of government schools. But, circumstances will make people think it afresh.
So what would you tell a parent who's listening and says, okay, I get it. I get the idea that I have a First Amendment right to control the education that my child hears and receives.
Shout it on the streets. Talk to your friends. Make it a living reality. Some of my friends here at Columbia were instrumental in the beginning of the gay rights movement. And we've had some wonderful conversations in which they explained to me how they did it. And the most important thing you start with are words. And of course, not just words, but the truth. And this is a truth. It's there in the Constitution. We have freedom of speech, and parents are required by law to educate their children and have a free speech right in this, which is threatened when they're pressured to send their children to public schools. So it seems to me this has to be talked about. We need videos. We need debates. We need these sort of programs, because once it seeps into the consciousness of the country, then it'll become a reality. But one has to get it. One has to do consciousness raising first before you just rush into court.
Right. It's interesting because I had a debate with a teacher friend of mine recently who was saying, I was saying, well, where did the teachers get the authority to undermine express parental wishes? The specific thing we were talking about is if a child is experiencing gender dysphoria and that child wants to change his name and pronouns at school and the parents are opposed to it. Why does the teacher get to undermine the parents and decide? And she said to me, well, she said two things. She said, it is the job of the teacher to affirm the desires of the student, not the desires of the parent, that they are there to serve the student, not the family. That's number one. And number two, she said, well, where did the parents get the right? Where do the parents get the right to say that it's their decision? In other words, the assumption by this friend was that the right was that of the school or the government, and in order for a parent to assert a right against them, I had to come up with something specific. I hadn't read your article at the time, or you hadn't written it, so I wasn't able to say, well, that right is vested in the First Amendment. I simply made the converse argument, which I think Inez was getting at before, which is that, well, no, human beings have certain natural rights, including the right to raise their family as they see fit, and the government can't infringe on that without a very good reason.
And it's true, but the government does have an interest in educated populace. The danger is when it takes an interest in how they're educated and specifying a certain sort of a civic education that's convenient to government. Tocqueville, it takes a French aristocrat to come to America to actually understand us. We can't do it. Tocqueville comes here and he warns against a tutelary government, a government that's saying, well, I'll help you, I'm going to teach you, I'm going to approve you. You should be a little worried about this. My mother grew up in Nazi Germany. And fortunately, at the age of 8, when all the children were expected to raise their arm in a Nazi salute and to sing the Horst Wessel-Lied, she just refused, which had the blessing of her having to leave town very, very fast. That's what saved the family. And it strikes me, we're far from that. And it's in part because parents recognize their independence, that we don't have a submissive population yet. But it's important to stand up for our freedom. Germany was a very civilized country, right? So the most civilized countries can end up being very uncivilized. And again, I don't want to attribute any of that to any of the people we might disagree with here. That's not the point. The point is simply that however civilized we are, we always have to be attentive to our freedom. And that means standing up for freedom of speech. It's the most basic of our rights. And if we can't stand up for that as to our children, what's the point?
Is this simply an issue of evolving pluralism in a way that essentially you have the framers putting together the Constitution, then obviously the Bill of Rights gets ratified in addition to that. But still the United States is quite a religiously homogeneous country, even though there are all of these denominations of Protestants. But fundamentally, the United States is overwhelmingly Protestant. Of course, there are Jews, Muslims, Catholics in small numbers, but these institutions are built. I'm thinking here something similar of like how religion got disestablished, right, in the states, right? Some states did not have an established religion, but most of the northern states had an established denomination of Protestantism until some of exactly these kinds of issues started cropping up. And do we send the school money to the Congregationalists, or do we send it to the Methodists, or do we send it to the Unitarians? And then all of a sudden there started to be a development of this push to abolish state support for the church in these states because nobody could agree on which church the money was supposed to go to, right? And do you imagine that something similar might happen here in the sense that we're no longer talking about it in a religious context, we're talking about it in just various families want their children, we have a very pluralistic country, we have wildly different views on all kinds of important things that children ought to be instructed in. Do you think that instead of fighting each other, there might be that kind of disestablishment of public schools? Or do you think that public schools are, or as commonly constituted, a common school idea is now so embedded in American culture from the last 150 years that that kind of disestablishment process is unlikely, and what we really need to do is sort of carve out exceptions, carve out the ability to sort of dissent and to have your preferences funded equally?
Right. I think you're absolutely on point that we're witnessing a sort of disestablishment movement. I think that's absolutely on point. It happens that it's a free speech argument, but it is akin to disestablishment in the late 18th century, and it is a result of in some ways a result of our diversity, and that diversity is actually quite valuable. In the 18th century, it already was religiously diverse, at least amongst Protestants. And that's what led to the disestablishment of the churches. In the 19th century, Protestants find unity in beating up on Catholics. And because it was treated as the Protestant majority versus the dangerous Catholic minority, one ended up having essentially the defeat of Catholics in public or publicly funded institutions. But America is much more diverse now, and it's hard to draw simple distinctions like that. And that's probably healthy. And it does create the social circumstances in which I think we can rightly assert our free speech rights here. Now, what the solution is, that's more complicated. Should it be exemptions from taxation? Should it be vouchers? Should it be something else that we haven't imagined yet? I can, could be all sorts of possibilities. And notice, I don't know. And notice, this is not an argument against public schools. It's against the system. It's against a system that pressures you into public schools. We could still have public schools, but there'd be less financial pressure to pushing you into them. So the net results could be complicated, could vary from state to state. I'm entirely agnostic about all of that. I'm just a lawyer. I'm just pointing out a legal argument. And I think it's an important legal argument because it will liberate us from being pressed into situations that we don't really want. And it's not just where there's indoctrination, just teaching that is no good. Imagine being poor in a neighborhood with bad public schools.
Right.
Disaster. Are we so enlightened that we're going to shove this down on the poor while middle-class people or wealthy people struggle to send their kids to private schools? That's utterly corrupt and biased. So we need freedom of speech and education, and guaranteed by the Constitution. But what results? I'd actually like to see a diversity of possibilities. Then we'd experiment and we'd actually know. But back to your main point, yes, it's like a disestablishment movement, but with a different legal angle. And I hope it has the same resounding success.
Jennifer, I don't know if you have another question in the next 2 minutes, or if we want to start wrapping it up. I know.
No, just thank you so much for joining us and for elaborating on your excellent piece in the Wall Street Journal. I urge anyone who hasn't read it to look it up and give it some thought.
May I just add, amongst your listeners, to all of you, thank you for listening. And at the new Civil Liberties Alliance, we work on conditions cases. So whether it's on schools or other conditions cases or administrative cases, we're always interested in hearing. We can't take all the cases, but if there's a case that will change unlawful power, we'd love to hear about it. So thank you. Thanks so much.
I should point out for those not in the legal sphere that your representation in Professor Hamburger's organization will come free of charge to you. They are interested in changing the law, and they will gladly review your case. And if they have the resources, they will gladly take on your case for free of charge to you. So it's always good to have excellent lawyers like Professor Hamburger on your side. This has been At the Bar. We hope you join us again in 2 weeks. Jennifer?
At the Bar is a production of Independent Women's Forum. It's available for viewing on Facebook, YouTube, and IWF.org, and is also available for download on all your favorite podcast apps: iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, TuneIn, Stitcher, Google Play, iHeartRadio, and others.
We'll see you in a couple weeks, as I said, at the next At the Bar.